This is Mid-Morning on Minnesota Public Radio. I'm Kerri Miller. This hour, Beryl Bissell's amazing life in and out of a monastery. Beryl Singleton Bissell was 18 when she left her family in Puerto Rico and vanished from the outside world into the closed society of a cloistered order of nuns. From then on, Bissell's life was a combination of prayer, hard work, and isolation. Her parents could visit, but they could only see and talk to their daughter from the other side of a gate. But if a life like that sounds serene and contemplative, for Bissell, it was just the opposite in some ways. She struggled with anorexia and ultimately the loss of her vocation. She was also falling in love with a priest, and both would eventually leave their religious orders to marry. Bissell writes in the epilogue of her memoir, "Perhaps I'd have become the compassionate woman I longed to become as a young nun had I stayed in the monastery, but because I left, I have memories rich with presence to cherish and a faith in which my loved ones live." Beryl Bissell's memoir is called The Scent of God, and she joins me in the studio, and it's good to have you here.
Oh, it's great to be here. Thank you.
So you're a sophomore in a Puerto Rican high school, and you go on a spiritual retreat, and you have a dream, a very vivid dream, and in some ways that opens the path that will ultimately lead you to the monastery. Is that right?
Yes, it was really a searing experience, and it changed me, and it's still a very prevalent sensation that I have now. Is that dream? It marked me.
Tell us what you dreamt.
Oh, well, the priest, I had been at this retreat, and the priest told us to find out who we were because we had a mission. God had a mission for us in the world, and I had no idea what he meant about finding out who you are. So I went home that night, and I was struggling to do this, and I thought, I don't know what I'm doing. I didn't realize it takes a lifetime, really, to find out who you are. But I fell asleep, finally. And as I was sleeping, I had this experience of God's love. It was so intense. I didn't see the hand, but it was like a hand reaching down to me, and I was striving for it, and my whole body was so powerful that it felt like my body was being torn apart. But it was this love that was so great that I knew I was totally loved. And I wanted to reach that hand. I wanted to be immersed in that love. I wanted to be penetrated by that love. And I knew to do that I had to die. And I wanted to die that night. And I woke up sobbing because I wasn't dead. I was still alive.
You were 16? Is that?
Yeah, I was around 16 at the time, right.
You describe that dream in the book as rapturous and full of overwhelming tenderness. And that, as I said, it lays out the path that will ultimately take you to this monastery. But do you think, had you not had that dream, had you not experienced that, you'd thought about how committed you were to God before that? But do you think that perhaps the path would have never led to the monastery?
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. I really, I think I wanted to get married eventually, even though my parents had a tormented marriage. A child always dreams of this perfect marriage, and I really liked the Puerto Rican boys. And I dreamed of marrying a Puerto Rican boy, yeah.
Do you think, Beryl, in some ways that God was intervening in a very active way in your life?
Well, when I finished writing the book, I saw that it appeared that God had intervened continuously in my life, and I really believe that God does enter our lives, but we have to be aware. Have to be looking for it. And I really was not as aware of God's intervention in my life until I wrote the book. And then I kept seeing how things happened. Talk about serendipity. The book is full of it.
Can you describe the day that you entered the cloister? I should say, for listeners who haven't had a chance to read the memoir yet, that you decide that you're going to go into an order of nuns, and you send out letters, and you get a very encouraging letter back from the woman that runs this monastery in New Jersey. You tell your parents, they weep, they're very unhappy about the idea that you're going to become a nun. Tell me about the day that you actually enter the monastery at age 18.
Well, that was a day I yearned for, And it was incredibly happy for me and incredibly tormenting for my parents, who had finally succumbed to my continual petitions to be able to enter the monastery. And it started out, shall I tell the story about the Madras jacket?
Yes.
My brother Greg?
Yeah.
Well, I had an older brother, Greg, who was a rather eccentric character, wonderful, wonderful man. And he decided that he wanted to wear a Madras jacket to the monastery that morning. And my mother was so distressed because it was a very brightly colored jacket, and Greg insisted on wearing it. And I knew that he was delighting in this whole conflict thing. And maybe it was even a way of getting Mom's mind off what was going to happen later on. But he ended up wearing the jacket to the monastery. And we got there, and I thought I was going to go right in through the front doors, but instead we had to go to the parlor. And and I met the nuns there, the two nuns who would be very important in my life from that point on, the novice mistress and the abbess. Mm-hmm. And a bell rang. And well, first of all, my mother was shocked because when we entered that little room, there was a curtain drawn and a grating, like a fence, a chicken fence sort of thing. And when they pulled the curtain back, there was another fence on the other side, another one of these gratings. And it was difficult even to see the women behind those grates with all that obstacles there.
Right.
And my mother realized then that's how she would see me from now on.
I think that's extraordinary. I cannot imagine what your parents must have gone through to think that they might never hug you or touch you again once you were in the wall. They did, but she didn't know that at the time.
No. When I walked down the hall, my father said, "Beryl, you can change your mind. You don't have to go through with this." But I wanted this so badly, and I went forward to the doors with joy. My mother was standing stiff like she was frozen. And I embraced her quickly and then turned. And as I was walking through the door, she cried out, "I'll never be able to hug you again." And it didn't bother me at the time. But I remember turning around at that last moment and seeing, all I could see was my brother's Madras jacket outside the door. And I went in between those doors with such happiness. And it was only periodically that I would be overwhelmed with this sense of loss for my parents. Mm-hmm. I had this trunk of goods that you were told to bring with you, with all your little belongings. And the novice mistress started to take it away. And I said, "Oh, wait, my mother put some things in there that I want." And she said, "Beryl, you've given everything to God. These are not yours." And she took it away. And I think that was my first real sensation of loss and grief.
And what this was going to be like, what at the time that you thought for the rest of your life.
Yes, yeah. But it was something I wanted to do. I wanted to give myself to God this way. And I believed, and I still believe, that the monastery does provide a wonderful environment for reaching this transformation in God that I was striving for. But I didn't realize that before you can get there, you have to encounter all your darkness. And that will arise in the monastery.
And you did.
Yes.
In the monastery. In fact, yep. I'll ask you to read this first excerpt.
Yeah.
And it's from a passage in the book where you talk about fasting, your decision that you're going to deny yourself some things. You've been in the monastery how long at this point?
6 months.
Okay.
Not even 6 months, a little bit less than 6 months.
Will you read that?
Yes. As Sister Mary Beatrix, I began to fast in earnest. At first, abstaining from food was freeing. As my body grew lighter, so did my spirit. I was breaking the bond that connected my body with my soul. Light-headed with hunger, I became euphoric with prayer. I found myself spiraling to a place where the boundaries between me and the universe dissolved, an experience seared with color and white as light. Coming back was difficult. I returned feeling filled yet strangely empty. While fasting improved my prayer life, it did nothing to curb my appetite. My body begged to be fed, and I chose to starve it. At first, it took an extreme act of will not to eat, but I liked being in control. I even began to enjoy, if one could describe it as such, the pangs of hunger that made me weak and dizzy and cramped my belly at night. Look at you, Beatrix, I'd think, inordinately pleased with this new me. You're getting so strong. The pain I inflicted on my body by starving entered other areas of my life as well. I refused to use my shawl when it was bitterly cold and rejoiced when my hands and feet bled from chilblains. I knelt on the floor during prayers until my knees grew puffy and bruised. I whipped myself with a small knotted cord called the discipline until I drew blood. Medieval theological teaching that the body was evil and needed to be purged had infiltrated my spiritual life even as a child. My belief in bodily penance came from outdated books on asceticism and ancient lives of the saints. And I had the example of St. Clare herself, who, although she insisted that her sisters be moderate in practicing austerity, destroyed her own health by excessive fasting and penitence. In the beginning, I wanted my mother and power figure nuns in the monastery to notice how thin I'd gotten. I did not try to hide the fact that I was not eating, as other anorectics do. I wanted to be noticed. I wanted to stand out as an ascetic. This was almost an impossible task when custody of the eyes kept everyone's eyes on their own plates at meals. It didn't take long for fasting to assume a new, more insidious persona. It became my shadow, my tormentor. Fasting walked with me through the monastery halls. It accompanied me to chapel. It sat with me at table, lay down with me at night. Together, we thought constantly of food, discussed its flavors, and yearned for its textures. And on feast days, when the general fast was lifted, fasting and I trembled with the desire to eat. And always, even as we sighed and wept, we kept our mouths clenched and our hands tight-fisted. Soon I was eating almost nothing, a bit of lettuce, a sliver of egg, a cup of tea. Eventually I got the attention I craved. It came not from the novice mistress, nor the vicaress, but from another novice who said to me, "You must be very happy, because you'll be with Jesus soon. You look like you're dying." When my parents came to visit in the fall of 1958, they were stunned at my appearance. My mother gasped. I looked like an old woman, she said, her voice shaking with suppressed anger. I had lines running from my nose to my lips, and my temples were as concave as a skull's. I had wanted to surprise my parents with my new svelte body. I didn't know I looked old. I was 19. Did I really look like this, I wondered? There were no mirrors in the monastery.
Beryl Singleton Bissell reading from her memoir, The Scent of God. If you'd like to join our conversation this morning, 1-800-242-2828. In the metro area, 651-227-6000. If you're online with us this morning, you can go to minnesotapublicradio.org and click on Send a Question. The nuns eventually intervene, and that sets off a number of, I won't call them confrontations, right? But moments when they force you to reckon with what you're doing. Is that fair to say?
Well, yes, I almost got sent home because once they recognized my terrible weight loss, I was down to 90 pounds. They insisted that I eat, and it was almost like forced feeding, and I did not want to eat. I not only did food make me feel sick and ill, but this was one area of my life where I had some control. Mm-hmm. And I became very deceitful. I figured out all sorts of techniques how to avoid eating, to pretend I was eating, but not to eat. And I was caught one day. And when I was going through this period of deceitfulness, I was tormented because I knew what I was doing. And I wanted to stop. I wanted to be obedient, but I didn't. You know, it was like this terrible dichotomy within my soul where I was praying, "Oh God, help me get over this." And on the other side, I didn't want to be helped. So when I was caught and almost sent home, I made an about face, and I did start to eat. But again, it was only to please the nuns, because if I didn't eat, then I wouldn't be able to stay. So I ate to please the novice mistress, and from that point on, I saw her approval became so essential to my spiritual life that, again, my relationship with God sort of went out the window, because instead of living this quiet, hidden life in God, I was living to please this novice mistress. And eventually, when she left to form a new monastery in Bolivia, I remember being just torn apart, but so grateful she was gone, because now I could start to live for God again.
Do you think what you were going through, all of this, the eating disorder, the attachment to this one nun who ultimately leaves, is only about youth and inexperience, or was it something about the fact that you were not meant for that life in some ways, and there were some big signals coming to you that was the case? What do you think?
No, you know what I think? I think it's all part of maturing, but we didn't have the direction that we needed. I think I really needed some psychological help. And if people have asked me, would you have stayed if you'd never been sent home to Puerto Rico to help take care of your father? And within my soul, I really believe that I probably would have stayed. But I would have stayed, and I would have missed out on this whole wonderful world that I just love so dearly, and I would never have known Vittorio's love and the wonder of having children. So.
Let's talk about that. Your father, while you're in the monastery, your father has a stroke, and your mother's trying to care for him, and you get the news from, what is it, the director of the monastery?
Well, the abbess. Yeah,
okay.
The abbess is like a bishop in some ways within the monastery. She makes many of the decisions. And the abbess that we had at the time was very conservative. It was right after Vatican II, and my father was sending me all the new theologians, and I never even knew he was sending these books, because she packed them right out the door with every priest who came. And my father was so angry when he found out about that I had never even had a chance to know that he had sent me these books. But
she tells you that they're going to permit you to go to Puerto Rico.
which was so surprising. It was stunning, because we never went home. I mean, we made a vow to stay within the four walls of the monastery. It's called a vow of enclosure. And I really thought I would live there for the rest of my life. And to have Mother Paschal, of all people, say, I think it's God's will that you go home to help take care of your father, I was just stunned. And I found out later that it wasn't really her decision. She had been harassed and harangued by one of a very important person in Puerto Rico, Nelly Carrion, who was the wife of the president of my father's bank, who is very determined and obstinate, and she kept calling the abbess, and she called the Bishop of Trenton until they allowed me to go home.
Let me come back for a moment to that vow of enclosure that you said you take.
Yeah.
What purpose? And I know your mother raised this question too. She asked you in some ways, if you want to be of service to the world, why would you retreat behind the walls of a monastery? What good can you really do there?
Right.
What now looking back, what is the purpose of this?
The purpose of monastic life is to provide a place where a person can become totally imbued with God. And if you believe in the power of prayer, somebody who's so totally united with God has a leavening effect throughout the whole world. And
How?
A leavening, because they are so full and so whole in God's presence that, well, another thing that I believe in firmly is the fact that we are all one great body. Every person in this world, all of nature, and we're all related. We feed one another. Every decision we make affects somebody else. Maybe we never meet them or know them, but it's like a ripple effect, and everything we do has this ripple effect. And I believe right now that the more people that practice contemplative prayer, and there are many of them all over the world, that if there's going to be salvation for what's going on now, it'll come from them.
So you think today, even in our communities with the problems and the challenges that the world faces, there is definitely a place for the people who retreat behind the walls of a monastery and aren't out and of the world.
Yes, I do, and I believe they're supposed to be prophets. I think that the people need to be able to go to them for, wisdom, for the wisdom that they have. And the nuns that persevere, not all of them are perfect or wonderful, but I'll tell you, it takes a great deal of compassion and humanity to make the decision to stay. And the nuns who have stayed, many of them are extraordinary women.
Beryl Singleton Bissell is with us in the studio this morning. She's talking about her memoir, The Scent of God. We're going to take a break for news, and when we come back, we'll pick up the story when she leaves the monastery for the first time to go back to Puerto Rico, and how that sets off a chain of events that eventually leads to her leaving the cloistered life, to her marrying and having children and traveling and, well, so much more than that. Hi, Tom. You're on Mid-Morning.
Hi. Thank you for taking my call.
Mm-hmm.
I'm calling because I have a 23-year-old son that off and on has played with the idea of joining a contemplative order of men, and he expresses it's more of a flight from the world, I think. That he says he just doesn't want to participate in this system that is corrupt. I'm wondering, my question, I guess, to the author is how healthy is running away from something? I've got to get your book and I'm going to send it to him. But how healthy is it to flee the world?
Mm-hmm.
Is this some sort of a psychological problem that he has that maybe should be addressed?
All right, Tom, thanks.
Well, I can't speak directly to your son because I don't know him, but I know that, you really don't escape anything. He's going to, if he does decide to go in, first of all, I think he'll be screened out almost immediately, because now they really do insist that you go through psychological testing before you enter religious orders. And once you're there, you're going to be challenged, and you're going to encounter that dark side of yourself, and he's not going to be able to escape his desire to flee. Let's put it that way. And the world is corrupt, certainly, but if we all ran away from it, there would be nobody left here to work, to do the ministries that need to be done. So I hope that he finds, what he really needs to do.
Beryl, what is the best reason today, would you say, for entering a contemplative life?
Well, one of the reasons you would probably enter is this huge desire for God. It's like being reached out and touched by God, but also this desire for community. And for the stability that a community offers, the regime, the daily structure that provides for continual remembrances that you are there to serve God. 7 times a day, you go to chapel to say the divine office, which is psalms and petitionary prayer. And just your day being separated like that into these various segments reminds you why you're there, and you are living with people. You're going to find in the monastery that there are people who are difficult to live with, and you live with them for the rest of your life when you go in. So, especially a cloistered order.
To Nancy in Minneapolis. Hi, Nancy.
Yes, if I hadn't heard you talk, I wouldn't be asking this question. But I'm wondering why you stopped your memoir at about 10 years ago. I was looking in the epilogue thinking there would be something about your current life on the North Shore. And as I recall, you mentioned your husband, Bill, in the acknowledgments, and that was about it.
Yeah, that's the next book.
There's a sequel coming, Nancy.
Yeah.
Good news. You have so much more to write about.
Oh, I do. Yeah, I do. So much more has happened. in my life since then. And a memoir, basically, you're taking one segment of your life and you're reviewing it and you're trying to reveal the deeper truths locked within that story. So a memoir is not an autobiography per se. It's a digging deep into the truth behind what happened.
Let's pick up the story of your life. You leave the monastery to go back and help care for your father who's had a stroke. And you write in those days before you knew you were going to leave, how frightening it was to think about leaving the cloister. And when I read that, I wondered, were you afraid, do you think, of what you were going to confront in the outside world, or were you afraid of what you might succumb to once you got out there?
I was a very sensual young woman. My body had such power to respond to things, and I knowing the power of that. I mean, in Puerto Rico, I was really grateful that we had chaperones because. Yes.
Who knew what might happen?
Yeah, who knew what might happen? And, it was interesting that the fact that really kept me chaste and was not wanting to hurt my parents, even more so than offending God in any way. But I did not want to hurt my parents. But at the thought of going back to the world when they were going to send me home, I saw nothing in the world that I wanted, that attracted me. I didn't really want to marry at that point because I really still wanted to find God. And the world was a place where it was superficial. I felt, when you're a teenager, you can be so judgmental. And I remember thinking, life is so superficial. Everybody's just bent on gratification. And I didn't want to live that kind of a life. And I didn't know if I could do that in the world. Live a life of depth in the world. And so that was one of the things that concerned me in going back.
Until you met Vittorio.
Yeah, until I met Vittorio. Actually, it was even before I met Vittorio. It was that first morning I woke up in Puerto Rico, and I was seized with this huge sense of freedom that I did not expect to encounter. The sun was pouring in through the window. We had a condominium that looked right over the ocean. And I looked down, and it was so glorious. And there was a man jogging down there on the beach. And I could hardly wait to get out on the street and walk with people. I think now, as you endure crush and traffic jams, how could I ever have been so excited about walking with people? But I left and I went to Mass that morning, and I was saying my prayers, and heard everybody stand up, and I looked up, and there was this priest walking onto the altar, and he was, I knew, I'm very intuitive. I've had a lot of intuitive experiences in my life, and I knew instantly that this priest was going to change my life, and I did not want my life changed. So I disliked him intensely. Everything about him irritated me. His theatricalness, the way he wanted us to sing. He had a beautiful voice, and there were like 5 old ladies and me in church, and he wanted us to sing. And I thought, this is crazy. And so I went home and I asked my mother, I said, who is that priest? He has got too much black hair in the first place, and he looked unkempt, and she told me he was a professor at the university, and she thought he was a saint, a very holy, wonderful man. And he was a close friend of theirs. And it turns out that he was the priest that brought communion to my father several times a week. And I thought, I could go to Mass, to another Mass to avoid him, but he was the one who was going to come and bring communion every morning. And I was puzzled at this because I always make a point of trying to like people before I dislike them. And my mother said, why don't you bake a loaf of bread for him? And so I decided, well, maybe that would help me overcome this intense dislike. And so one morning I did decide to bake him bread.
And if you'll read an excerpt of that experience of bringing him bread and what he says.
Yeah. I loved baking bread, the feel of the dough under my hands, warm, growing smoother and more elastic as I needed it, cupping, pushing, and pressing until its surface shone like silk. I liked the fragrance of baking bread even better, the way it filled the apartment and wafted into the hallway, penetrating the elevator and funneling its way down the stairs to the front lobby. I baked bread for my parents, for Padre Ramirez at Stella Maris, the parish church in Condado, for the young doctor who cared for my father at the Presbyterian hospital. But I had no intention of baking bread for Padre Vittorio, not even when my mother suggested it. But he has no one to look after him. He'd love a loaf of your bread. No one to look after him, I sputtered. Why does he need looking after? The thought of that flamboyant priest needing care set me bristling. Why were we supposed to dote on priests anyway? Let him take care of himself. Even his name irritated me, Padre Vittorio. Such a triumphant name, he probably chose it himself. He gives himself to everyone. He takes no time for himself. He's a saint, I think, my mother answered. On the occasion of Padre Vittorio's visits to bring communion to my father, I realized that even though he was nice enough, my initial antipathy toward him had never waned, and I wondered why I felt so irritated every time I saw him, especially when I usually made an effort to like people. One morning, as I was escorting him back to the front door after he'd blessed my father, I decided to offer him bread after all. Perhaps reaching out would help me conquer my dislike. I baked bread this morning, Padre. Would you like a loaf? The priest's face brightened. You baked bread? How wonderful. I would be honored. While I wrapped the bread, which was still warm from the oven, Padre Vittorio waited in the living room. I noticed him wiping his hands against the sides of his cassock, and I wondered whether he was nervous, and that thought made me smile. Here you are, Padre, I said, holding out the bread. But instead of taking the proffered loaf, he bowed, and he opened his hands so that I had to give it to him, and he stood there cupping the bread as if it were made of gold. Why, he thinks I've baked it just for him, I thought, already regretting my gesture. It was just a loaf of bread, yet he was behaving as if I'd just given him the baby Jesus. When you come to communion, he said, his voice quavering, I think, what is this angel doing, taking communion from me? And now you give me bread. I looked up and I noticed for the first time that his eyes were the color of dark caramel, that his nose was chiseled like that of Michelangelo's David, and his lips were full and gentle. Funny, I'd not noticed he was handsome. It's easy in retrospect to see this moment as a turning point in the direction my life would take. It was also a turning point in his. According to his nephew Carlo, who was living with him at the time, Vittorio went home, placed the bread on the table, and said, She baked me bread. She baked me bread with her own hands.
Beryl Singleton Bissell reading from her memoir, The Scent of God. We have an online question here, Beryl, from Maggie in Hayward, Wisconsin, and she writes, Your recall of events is amazing. Did you keep a journal your entire life?
No, I really didn't start keeping a journal until after Vittorio died, and I wish I had had a journal. One thing that I always was, and it was because I was a very interior type child who liked to be alone and who found insecurity surrounding her, I was very observant. Mm-hmm. I listened a lot, and I looked a lot, and being sensuous also and sensual, I've experienced. I remember the color of days and things, and some instances that I wrote about here, they were so vivid that they were as clear as if they had just happened. The one thing with the dialogue is you really cannot recall dialogue as it comes. But what I did in doing the dialogue, I did it as accurately as I could. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to bring the tone of the conversation into that dialogue. And some words, like Vittorio's words, I'll never forget them. They were so powerful. And also my mother's words to me about when I was telling her I was losing my vocation. I couldn't keep coming down to Puerto Rico to help her. I couldn't tell her why, that I was falling in love with Padre Vittorio. And she looked at me and she said, what kind of a vocation is it if you can lose it so easily? And I knew I had caused her so much suffering, and here I was losing this vocation that had caused her such anguish. Yeah.
Your mother knew how to get right to the heart of the matter.
Oh, she did, yeah.
One of the things that struck me about the memoir is that I don't know what you held back, but you pull no punches about yourself in this memoir. And
It took me 20 years.
to work up the courage?
Well, not 20 years to work up the courage. I was learning how to write, so I was writing about little vignettes, these images that were very clear and wonderful, and that's all I had.
But Beryl, you write that scene about caring for your father and that moment when, you know, you realize you've been terribly unkind to him, and I
not
just
just unkind, abusive, to my father.
You were frustrated with caring for him and his disability, and you shouted some terrible things at him.
Yeah, I was so convinced that he had brought the sickness on himself, and I had no sympathy because he hadn't taken care of his health, and because he was a drinker and a smoker, and he had messed up my life. I mean, I was there, and I was losing this vocation that I wanted to be faithful to so badly. And he was, I remember his words when he told me this joke that a doctor had seen him smoking after he had had this very severe heart surgery and had put the cigarette out on his arm. And he said, every puff on this cigarette is a nail in your coffin, Ferd. And Daddy's twinkling eyes said to me, he was telling me this story, and I looked at him and I said, what are you going to do when you become a basket case? And he said, I'll handle that when the time comes. But it wasn't him. It was us. Right. But of course, he was too. I've grown so much in understanding about suffering, and I needed to go through all these things, let's put it that way.
Were there moments, though, when you wrote the memoir that you thought, I don't want to tell people what I've done?
You bet. Actually, I had thought I had finished the manuscript, and it went out to an agent who called me back, and she said, I'd like to talk with you about your manuscript. She said, you have an incredible story, but you haven't told it yet. And
really?
What she said was, you touch, I don't know if it's your reticence as a nun, but you touch on huge issues, and then you don't deal with them. So, she'll say, you could send this out to other agents, and there's going to be somebody who's going to love the book just the way it is. But this, you need to go deeper. And at the time, I had already rewritten it like 7 times, trying to get to the truth beneath the story, the surface story, without exposing myself so totally. And I couldn't work on that book. For 2 years, I just put it aside. And I read a lot of memoirs. I read a lot of mystical theology, and I read about anorexia. And when I came back to it, I reread the story, and I thought, oh my gosh, she was absolutely right. I haven't told the story. So when I went back to rewrite it, I cried and I sobbed, and I told the story. And there I am in all my darkness.
And glory.
And glory.
Let's take a call from Joe in Philadelphia. In Philadelphia, Joe?
Hi, Beryl. Yes, this is Joe from Philadelphia. I'm a former Catholic priest, and I have a wonderful, loving relationship with a religious sister. We're planning on being married in the near future, and we just want you to know how much your book means to us, how much strength and hope we receive from your writings. And we look forward to seeing you someday in Philadelphia if you're ever in this area.
Well, thank you for calling, Joe, and thank you for reading the book. How did you find it? How did you know that this book was there?
Actually, my future wife found it by word of mouth.
Uh-huh.
And she is, I think she's rereading it for about the 3rd time now, Beryl. And, but it has brought us such hope that there is life after religious life.
Well, yes.
And make it.
I've met so many incredible couples, nun and priest couples, who have so devoted to the church yet unable to exercise their ministries because they fell in love. So good luck to you, Joe, and blessings and healing for both of you.
Beryl, Vittorio did not necessarily want to be a priest, but what becomes revealed through your courtship, as you both talk about leaving your religious orders and what life will be like after that, is that he had, is it right to say he has more of a difficult time separating than you did?
He had a much more difficult time. He had been a priest for 30 years, and he had become a very good priest. I mean, he was so totally dedicated to his vocation and committed. And all these years he had persevered, and then this little woman waltzes into his life and shakes everything up. And I recognized that. And many times I tried to leave him, and we were always thrown back together again because I recognized the struggle he was going through. But I was caught in this struggle, and it made me so angry when he would keep changing his mind, and or the church would get him to change his mind. I felt like I was being tossed back and forth like a badminton, never knowing where I was going to land. And I didn't want him in my life if that's what was going to happen. I wanted to have a life. And as long as he was there loving me, I was confined by this love, and I loved him, but I couldn't be near him and maintain a chaste relationship. He could. He was really strong in that respect. But I did not want that. And I tried everything I could to seduce him. Oh, my goodness. Yeah, it was such a struggle. This was after I left, mind you. It wasn't when I was still a nun.
Right. You'd left the order.
That's right. Yes, I was out.
You were out in the world. Well,
Yep.
what do you think was the turning point? Was it the cancer diagnosis for Vittorio when he realizes he's going to have to make a choice?
You know what it was? Definitely, he didn't know he had cancer when they operated on him that time in Italy. Mm-hmm. But I think he recognized that he was close to death, dying, and he recognized that this love was something that he wanted. Because when I went over there to see him, and he didn't know he had cancer, but he took me everywhere. He introduced me to all his friends, all the people that he had hidden me from the first time I was there, where now this is my joy, this is my gift. He committed himself then, but the church was still holding back on that dispensation. So it was only when I told him that he had cancer, finally, because I thought he needs to know he has cancer before he leaves the priesthood, because he might not want to leave. He's got to be at peace with God. And so it was my responsibility to tell him. And that very night he called Rome and said, I want my dispensation. The time difference allowed him to call Rome. It was in the morning there. But the canon lawyer that was working with him. And then the Bishop of Trenton assisted us in pushing this dispensation through.
There's a line in that moment that you write where I think you say, Vittorio chose me over death. Is that right?
Well, I can't recall the exact line, but definitely he did. He lived. But he lived with pancreatic cancer for close to 5 years, right, which is miraculous in itself. And that was a choice he made every day to survive this disease, even though the American doctors thought it had been a misdiagnosis. Our love, and he wanted to live for the children. He chose me, he chose the children over death. He was not going to die. And so when he actually did start to die, I couldn't understand it. I thought, why are you giving up? How can you do this? Don't you know how much we need you? Yeah.
Let's take a call from Nancy in Minneapolis. Hi, Nancy.
Yes. I don't know if this will resonate with you, but I heard you talking about your father. First of all, I'm a nurse, and I spent the first decade of my adult life working in nursing homes with elderly. And then my dad, now, I'm 53 now, he has Alzheimer's, and he's living in a nursing home. I've also had struggled with depression most of my life. So then to visit him in the nursing home and seeing him that way makes me feel depressed to the point of feeling suicidal.
Oh, my.
So I feel torn.
I think we lost Nancy's call.
We lost Nancy, yeah.
But I think the essence of what she was going to ask you about was that choice you faced even when you were caring for your father. If I do this, I'm going to lose my life over here. Mm-hmm. Can I really sacrifice everything I've built to do this?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is a choice, and it's a devastating choice. Boy, Nancy's got, a huge issue that she needs to deal with somehow. But the one thing, I don't know what kind of advice to give Nancy. She needs to take care of herself, because if she doesn't, she won't be able to go visit her father even when she does go, right?
Beryl, there's a scene in the book where you, Vittorio is now aware that he has cancer, and you're on your way to the doctor's office.
Oh, he's dying, I think, right?
And really is feeling sick at this point as well. The car breaks down.
Yeah.
And you have a tantrum. You get out of the car, and he knows what you're going to do, and you're shouting, "Thanks for nothing, God," and it's your fault, and those kinds of things. The thing that struck me about that scene was, after having left the religious order, the intimacy that you still had with God, that your first... Most people would kick a tire and yell, but you have that. You had that ongoing conversation and intimacy with God. That's who you're directing the anger at.
Well, really, I would say that it's like the warp and woof of the texture of me is this presence of God. So even when I've had a testy relationship with the Catholic Church, I drifted away from it for quite some time. I always had a close relationship with God.
And you separate the two.
Yes, I do.
You make that clear in the book.
Yeah, I do. Right. I love the church deeply, but there are times when I don't feel at home in the church.
I know our listeners are saying, and then what happens next? What happens next? Vittorio dies of pancreatic cancer.
Right.
And what happens in your life? We know you ultimately end up in northern Minnesota.
Right. Well, that's the next book. And I hope the readers don't mind if I don't share that right now. One of the reasons is I talked about my life so often that this book took a long time to get written. When you're talking about it all the time, you don't write it because you're telling that story,
right.
Even though you're not telling it as it really needs to be told. And I really want to get this story told.
Understood. Raising your children, what happens with the death of your daughter. You do write that.
Yes.
You put that at the end of the book.
I wasn't going to put it in. And a woman who helped me, who was actually out there sitting on the swing with me when she asked me, was it a mistake to leave? She said, you have to write an epilogue, and you have to include Francesca's death. So I did, but I just deal with it very lightly.
When you sat down here this morning, you said there's going to be a sequel, and you said, and it's going to be as hard to write as this first part of my life has been. It's hard to imagine.
Yeah, well, it is, because I made some choices that I should not have made. And there's regret and guilt. Again, you have to work your way through that one. And, your precious children, were you responsible for the pain that entered their lives by the choices you made?
Will you come back and
I
read
will.
from the
I
sequel
will.
and
You
talk
bet.
with us?
Yes, I'd love to, Kerri.
It's been good to have you here.
Yeah.
Beryl Singleton Bissell's memoir is called The Scent of God, joining us this morning in the studio. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Kerri.